So we're here at Curraghatoosane outside Listowel, and we're excavating the site of a traditional cottage, a vernacular structure. And the building was here for over 100 years, so from around the 1840s at least until the 1950s. So it's been occupied for over 100 years, and it's through a very tumultuous part of Irish history, so spanning from the famine to the Irish Republic. It's a type of building that is very rare in the landscape today. So it's a two-room cottage. It would have originally been thatched, and the walls are made out of mud or cob, which would have been really common in the 19th century, but many of these types of buildings, because of the way that they survive in the landscape, there's very few of them remaining today. So what we're getting here is a really interesting look into a slice of the social history of Listowel and sort of the lives of everyday people who would have lived in this part of the country.
We've just started to excavate the vernacular house here at Curraghatoosane, and we're putting this test trench through one of the rooms of the house. We're taking it down to natural here, just to give us an idea of the depth of the archaeology, and we'll get some nice sections along the sides here, which will give us an idea of the floor surfaces that were in the original house.
So just walking in along the outside of the house to the south, along the outside cobbles, coming in the entrance, and this is the main room of the house, the main living area. We've got a concrete surface, there's some external wall there to the south, and we're just coming up along where the hearth was, the heart of the home, the fireplace. Outside you can see this big limestone slab, flagstone, and we've got some deposits here from the clean out from the fire and the general fire activity. This redder area in the middle here is probably where the main hearth was. This is where the crane and most of the activity and the conversation went on in this house. There was also a coin found in relation to this hearth. It appears to be a 1948 penny.
I suppose we have to remember that for the life of this house, it never had electricity. All light would have come from the fire, all cooking would have been done on the fire. And we found, for example, a lovely candlestick as part of the assemblage from the building. So we have to really cast our minds back to this other world where there was no electricity, no running water, and everything had to be brought in and out and done by hand. So we only have traces of the foundations, but we can see where they were in relation to the cobbles and in relation to a later lime mortar floor that was probably added in the late 19th or early 20th century as part of the process of improvement. And this is something that we see a lot in these types of buildings. So they have multiple phases and they go through different life cycles depending on who's in them. The house is built in a really wet site, and we have a clue to this in the name of the townland itself, Curraghatoosane. So Curragh of course means a wet or a marshy place. And because of this wet site and the fact that the walls are made out of wood, the people who built it had to inbuild a number of specific features to help to accommodate for the dampness and to try and keep the mud walls of the house as dry as possible. So they did a number of things in order to deal with this. So the first is they built subfloor drains under the building to try and keep the earthen floors of the building dry. The second thing is they put loads of cobbles around the building and drains. So in the first phase we have a simple drain that runs around the building, and this would have served to channel water away from the earthen walls of the house, and also to keep any water falling off the thatch to keep it away from the walls. In the second phase we see laying out of extensive cobbling. So in the north of the building we have a really beautifully cobble set drain, and this is a feature that comes up in a number of vernacular structures in the area. So the drain is about 1 metre wide, and it's got a lovely gully in the middle, and it carries the water right off the site away from the building. And similarly on the southern side of the building we have a big area of sloping cobbles that carry all the water away from the walls. In the early 19th century it wasn't very unusual for small tenants to keep animals inside the house. In certain parts of the country we have a type of building called a byre house where cows are actually accommodated in the house with the people, and people at the time didn't think this was strange or unusual. It was just part of their cultural practices. Towards the late 19th century, and particularly coming into the 20th century, there was big moves to take the animals out of the house and to improve the buildings, make them more hygienic, make them cleaner. And one of the ways we see this is by the addition of byres to these type of small tenants, small farmer settlements. And we have a lovely example of a byre here at this site, and it's added on at a later phase of the settlement's history. It originally had a beautiful cobbled floor with a drain to take the effluent outside and into the broader drainage system connected to the site. But then at a later period, probably in the 20th century, we get the addition of a concrete floor over the cobbling. Again, that constant move to improve and upgrade these types of vernacular settlements. We'd expect a vernacular structure such as this to have a thatched roof, and we're able to corroborate this through a number of pieces of evidence. The first is oral history. So many people who've come up to us who remember the house or have been able to tell us that they remember it having a thatched roof. The second piece of evidence is through the documentary record. The censuses of 1901 and 1911 have an accompanying house sheet that tells us for certain what we know through the archaeological record, that the walls were made of wood, but also that the house was thatched. So one of the strengths of historical archaeology, of studying later sites like this from the 19th and 20th centuries, is that we're able to combine the archaeological material with historical documents and historical records, so we can really flesh out the lives of the people who lived in this building and other buildings like it. In the case of this site, we've been able to track back the residents of the house, the people who lived here in the 1901 and 1911 censuses. So in the 1901 census, the house was occupied by Mary and James Connor and their 4 adult children, they ranged in age between 14 and 25. James was 60 in 1901, so he would have been born in and around 1840, just before the famine struck. Bill's sister Mary Ann was 25 in 1901, and we can see on the census that she was a dressmaker. During the excavations, we found a number of artefacts that potentially belonged originally to Mary Ann and were associated with her occupation. So for example, we found a number of buttons, but most interestingly, a small thimble. And it's really amazing to have this tangible connection to this person who we can see in the documentary records and these material objects that must have belonged to her. We're here at Curraghatoosane on the last day of our excavation, which is also our site open day. So today we're hoping to open the site up to the public to allow them to come in and to see the work that we've been doing here over the last 3 weeks. During this period, we've been investigating a really important slice of the social history of Listowel and its surrounding area. We've been investigating a vernacular or a traditional building, a house that was here from before the famine, so probably from around the 1820s, 1830s, and it was occupied all the way up until the 1950s. Throughout this period, the house was occupied by one family, the Connors, and of course we're in the Kerry O'Connor lordship. So the Connors were a family who had a really important presence here from the medieval period all the way through to the present day.
My grandmother Ellen O'Connor, or Mrs. Jack Cordon's wife, she lived here with her brother Bill. And I used to visit here with my father James Cordon when I was quite small. And but I remembered it as a small little white mud house, you know, with a half door, and just 2 very elderly people living in there, you know.
The workhouse up here, this is about a hint of this road here, and they used to bring the bodies down from there's a wall up there with an arch in it, and the doors were there, and they used to bring him down here in the morning. There was a man there used to call him Ned the Dead, and he brought down the coffins, and they were crisscross in the car, and if he didn't have enough, he'd have to wait for somebody else to die. And that time they were taking him up to Gale Cemetery, and when they took him up to Gale Cemetery, then they buried him there. But in the meantime they bought this place, but it took about 2 years before they could sort it out, and they started moving the bodies then across the road here into this famine graveyard here.
Over the last 3 months, the team from Archaeological Management Solutions have been working hard to excavate the sites that have previously been unknown on the route of the Listowel Bypass. And that has led to some really interesting discoveries. These range from the Fulloch Fields in Coolnaleen and Garryanton Valley, probable early medieval or early Christian charcoal production pits in Coolnaleen, very interesting worked timbers of as yet unknown date in Curraghatoosane, and the remains of a 19th century house at Curraghatoosane. And while the work was done to comply with national monuments and planning legislation, the great thing is that it has also been of great interest to the local community. And through events like the Open Day that was held at the Curraghatoosane house excavation, already the local community have been able to learn about both the process of excavation and also the sites that the team have found here on the Listowel Bypass.